Rich Lowry, the editor-in-chief of National Review magazine, joins me to discuss the influential William F. Buckley Jr., who was the intellectual leader of the conservative movement for over 50 years. Mr. Lowry undertook the formidable task of succeeding Mr. Buckley as editor-in-chief of National Review. We explore Mr. Buckley's impact on past Republican presidents and his significant relationship with President Ronald Reagan. Additionally, we examine the current meaning of conservatism and how it has evolved with the influx of populism overshadowing the classical liberal ideas traditionally associated with the Republican Party. As we approach the 100th anniversary of William F. Buckley Jr.'s birth on November the 24th, 2025, it is fitting to discuss this prominent figure with the man who succeeded him at National Review. Join us. Welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me. Delighted to be here.
I'd like to start with that gentleman who passed over to you the keys for National Review in 1997, Mr. Lowry, and he wrote a book, and I wanted to put up on our share screen timeline that PBS provided. And I'll have to tell you, Rich, that when I was 9 years old, I turned on Channel 12, which in Philadelphia was PBS, and there was a gentleman sitting there with a clipboard. And my father said, John Robert, which is my name, he said, I want you to listen to this man. And this is a man who's very intelligent and somebody you can learn a lot from. And ever since that moment, I have revered and will always revere William F. Buckley Jr. And I have to say, Mr. Lowry, that one of the good aspects of LBJ's great society was creating PBS, because we wouldn't have seen Firing Line without that, would we?
I never thought of it that way. Yeah, but history works out in funny ways.
Yes, it does. Ask you about Bribe for the People impact. Mr. Buckley's book, written at Yale as he enrolled in Yale University, and the book that he wrote, God and Man at Yale. That was had a tremendous impact on the conservative movement in the late 50s, didn't it?
It did. So Bill was in the military, and then went to Yale, was a little older, and had an immediate impact. Was the editor of the Yale Daily News. His editorials were written about and discussed in all sorts of circles, not just at Yale. And when he left, he wrote this excoriating attack on Yale. Now, what he was complaining about at that time, from our point of view, seems incredibly innocent. Basically, the curriculum and the professors weren't Christian and capitalist enough. But what he identified was this seed that unfortunately ramified and grew and got larger and larger over time, and has become what now is an academic elite that's been totally taken over by the woke mind virus. So unfortunately, it didn't stem the tide, but it blew the whistle on what was happening and established Bill as a major intellectual figure.
Of course, the celebrated run for mayor of New York City, which many people never gave him a chance of winning, but he ran this campaign basically on principles. Discuss that and the legacy that just his mere running for the office was something that was well known and a great boost for conservatives in 1966.
Yeah, so this is in the wake of Barry Goldwater's cataclysmic defeat, and a lot of people saying the conservative movement was already dead and buried before it was even really getting started. And Bill ran for mayor knowing he was going to lose. You know, there's a famous line about if he won, what would he do? He'd demand a recount. But this was really, we hear a lot about the uniparty today. There was really a uniparty where you had a Republican Party that was quite liberal and indistinguishable in certain respects, or maybe even worse than the Democrats. And Bill was holding out the banner for an alternative. And one, it's amazing how many of his policy ideas were quite sound and are still relevant today. And two, he discovered a constituency that became very important to the Republican Party, what would be known as the Reagan Democrats eventually, and working class voters that have now gone over to Trump. But he found these voters in the outer boroughs, you know, the firefighters, the cops, the working guys who just thought the world gone crazy and common sense no longer had any hold whatsoever, and the city was going down the tubes, and they wanted someone at least to speak out and speak for something differently. And that's what Bill did.
Very interesting article that you'd put out with National Review, written by Alvin Felsenberg back in April of this year, correcting the record on William F. Buckley Jr.'s stance in civil rights, and discuss that a little bit. There was a little bit of miscommunication or misunderstanding on Mr. Buckley's views on civil rights. Of course, he took a very constitutionally conservative position, but as time grew on, he set the record straight, and I believe that Mr. Felsenberg's article successfully does that on Mr. Buckley's behalf to get the record straight on his record or his ideas on civil rights.
Yeah, so there are a couple editorials early in National Review's history on civil rights you just don't want to read. They're painful to read. It's painful to think that we publish them, but Bill and the magazine evolved on this question. His opposition in the mid-'60s to civil rights laws was based on the idea that they were running out of constitutional bounds and were going to help overly aggrandize the federal government. But NR was in favor of civil rights and voting rights. He did not get this right initially. He acknowledged as much. He said in interviews he changed his mind. And of course, he had a big role in excommunicating the nut jobs and anti-Semites from the conservative movement, most famously in his jettisoning and denouncing the Birchers, the John Birchers.
That's right. And Mr. Buckley then, of course, appeared on Firing Line. I believe there was over 1,500 episodes, Mr. Lowry, that he gave. A whole array of speakers he had on there, and many of them were not ideologically aligned at all, but there was great discussion, there was civil discussion, there was respectful debate on these programs, and they really were quite enlightening for the listener. Talk about the legacy of Firing Line, and this was a great podium, or a bully pulpit, of course, for Mr. Buckley to be on, to be able to encapsulate and share conservative views, but also take in the views of others. And in today's highly politicized world and the anger between one another, we don't see that type of commiseration that we do with Mr. Buckley and his guests on Firing Line for many years.
Yeah, so he was a very idiosyncratic and captivating TV personality because he did all sorts of things you're not supposed to do on TV. He leaned, he made strange motions with his tongue. He had kind of an odd accent. He didn't comb his hair always, and used words you didn't understand. Yes. Most of which any TV producer would say, don't do that. But it made for really compelling television, and he'd have all manner of guests on. He'd have heads of states on, he'd have performers on. It didn't matter whether they're conservative or liberal or radical. Muhammad Ali he had on, Allen Ginsberg, the poet, radical poet, he had on. And these could be very warm exchanges, even across ideological lines, but also they could be quite excoriating, and that there were genuine, deep felt clashes on this show. And he had, but he had what he called, I want to say interrogators. That isn't quite the right word, but he'd have Michael Kinsley, Jeff Greenfield, Mark Green, very committed liberals, also to be on the program. So Bill would ask the guest questions, and then he'd ask someone else to come in and ask the questions from the left, and then have a big argument. And that's the way it's supposed to work in a free society. Now, this was a precursor to programs like Crossfire, to cable TV, and the Crossfire, even in its heyday, wasn't Firing Line, but it was quite a good show, certainly by today's standards. But now we've gotten to a place where there's basically very little debate on cable TV, and if it is, it's always 3-1 or 5-1.
If you could talk a little bit about now your relationship with Mr. Buckley, when you came on the scene at National Review, and some of what was it that you learned from him, and how was he any different on television or what behind the scenes with you as the persona that he reflected on television? Talk a little bit about your relationship with Mr. Buckley.
Yeah, well, first of all, what you see is what you got, and one reason it worked he was totally authentic to who he was. He didn't just use big words when he was on TV. This is the way he really talked. And he was an incredibly warm person. He valued the individual really highly. He was very individualistic, idiosyncratic himself. He was never going to go along with any tribe or party line unless he sincerely believed in it himself, and he took each person as an individual and valued them as such. Obviously, he was an important mentor of mine, but he wasn't one to sit down and say, "Oh, here are the lessons. I'm going to impart this wisdom to you." He just hoped by seeing how he worked and how he operated, you'd kind of pick up what he wanted. But one of the, it really centered around how we were going to edit and publish the magazine. And one of his key imperatives there was take on the best arguments of the other side. Never use straw men, never misrepresent what they're saying. We should be able to defeat their arguments. If we can't, we'll admit they're right. Usually we don't think they're right, but we're not here to propagandize. We're here to persuade, which means arguing in a thoughtful and sincere way, and that was key to his advocacy in all realms throughout his career.
Went to great lengths to eliminate any logical fallacies that, as you say, he was looking for actual substance in debate. And today we don't see that with those that were the candidates and the many of the representatives we're electing. We just don't see policy being put forth. Talk a little bit about his relationship with Richard Nixon. And of course, he had said that he told his brother that he may not want to support Nixon after Watergate came out. But what was his thoughts on Richard Nixon? We've taken the position that Richard Nixon, and I've talked to Ambassador John Bolton about this, is that Nixon had a tremendous prowess for foreign policy, and he was probably one of the better presidents we've had in foreign policy. What was Mr. Buckley's opinion of President Nixon?
Well, it was complicated. It was complicated because Bill didn't consider Nixon one of us. If I'm not mistaken, National Review didn't endorse Nixon in 1968, but there was significant overlap, certainly compared to in opposition to the left, which was in the process of losing its mind at the time. But NR was not enamored of wage and price controls, aggrandizement of the creation of new federal agencies, and also détente. So there are a lot of things that Bill criticized Nixon over, and the tendency was to be defensive of him at the outset of Watergate. Attacked by a hostile media. That's our first reflex. Even to this day, obviously. But then over time, as Bill realized the seriousness of it and understood that Nixon was basically guilty, then he then he pulled the plug of National Review's support. And more importantly, Jim Buckley was part of the contingent that went to Nixon and just said, "Look, you're not gonna survive in office. You have to resign."
And then the culmination of Mr. Buckley's advocacy would have to be considered the presidential victory of Ronald Reagan, 1980, and of course Ronald Reagan gave one of the greatest and most important inaugural speeches January 20th of 1981, which we consider to be right there with FDR's 1932 address, and probably even greater because it's very reactionary towards New Deal politics. How much satisfaction did Mr. Buckley get from Ronald Reagan being president? And then was there a communique between the two? Did President Reagan utilize Mr. Buckley's intelligence and his acumen for policy and politics during his presidency?
Well, they're very close friends, and they're longtime friends, and really friends. It wasn't just a professional relationship. They vacationed together. Bill Buckley gave Ronald Reagan dogs, for, I don't know, it was for Christmas or his birthday or what. It's something you don't do to a casual acquaintance. And he had the highest respect for Reagan's intellectual talents. This is something that wasn't really truly appreciated until after Reagan's death, and we began to see how many radio scripts he'd written in his own hand and how thoughtful and well informed they are. But Bill always told a story of being on vacation with Reagan somewhere, and they're having a discussion late at night about whether the CPI was really accurate, whether the measure of inflation was accurate. And this involved, all sorts of technicalities, economic technicalities. And it got late, and Bill's like, I'm going to bed. And then he woke up the next morning and said that he found 3 or 4 handwritten pages on a yellow legal pad that had been shoved under his door by Reagan, further elucidating his thoughts on this. This was a man who was not a lightweight. Now, when Reagan won, there continued to be a warm relationship, and Reagan would reach out to Bill. What are you going to say about this, Bill? I hope you can support me on that. So it wasn't as though he was an insider in the administration, but there would be temperature taking and back and forth, or Bill would give him a heads up. We're not going to like this. We're going to criticize it. And we did, criticized Reagan. It was sort of a balls and strikes approach even then. When Reagan signed the INF deal, reducing intermediate range nuclear weapons in Europe, we said he lost the Cold War. We were wrong, but we were unafraid to criticize even someone who's a politician who's as close to us as Reagan was.
What were Mr. Buckley's thoughts on the subsequent administrations of Bush 43 and then, of course, George W. Bush? What were his, and of course, Mr. Buckley died, I believe it was 2004. What was his thoughts?
A little later,
2007 it may have been.
Yeah, he was not a fan of either, and thought we were in the course of kind of losing our way, especially on economic issues. We thought we were kind of losing touch with what he considered more the true faith. And he was skeptical of, and at times basically opposed to the Iraq War, the second Iraq War. He never came out and directly said it, but he thought the enterprise was overly optimistic and would be not worth the cost at the end. And unfortunately, he was basically correct about that, but he was not a fan of a big fan of either Bush. Might have liked them personally, especially the first, but not a fan of that style of Republican politics.
It's been said in conservative circles that with the winning of the Cold War, which was accomplished by Ronald Reagan in a masterful way, conservatism lost an impetus for an objective or for a goal, which Reagan clearly set when he became president. The end, he didn't think about the détente or trying to appease communism, Soviet communism. He wanted to end it, and he did it brilliantly. And after that accomplishment, conservatism has been floundering around. Did Mr. Buckley see that there would be the need for a focused objective for conservatives in the future after the Cold War win?
Yeah, I mean, there was efforts to find such a goal, but it's hard to substitute for a truly existential struggle against a totalitarian, anti-Western, deeply anti-liberal in every way you can imagine empire, right? It's good that we don't have that challenge. Now we're getting it again from China, but Islamic terrorism seemed as such a challenge for maybe a decade there. Obviously, we have huge cultural challenges, all sorts of challenges, but there's nothing that quite looms as large as the Cold War and is as unifying as the Cold War. Current conservatives are unified in their opposition to China, but I think you dig down. Would we really fight over Taiwan? I think there are going to be big divisions over that question if, God forbid, we ever face it. So we did lose a force for intellectual and ideological cohesion with the end of the Cold War. But all things considered, you'd rather win the Cold War. It's a good problem to have.
Abraham Lincoln's great Cooper Union speech that really put him on the presidential map back in 1860 in New York. He spoke of the fact that the slave power at that time, they considered themselves to be conservatives. And Lincoln turned it around and said, no, the true conservatives are the ones who go back to that old Declaration of Independence and reclaiming the conservative mantra for the Republican Party. And I remember years ago, Mr. Buckley being asked about what is conservatism, and he essentially said the same exact thing. In your mind, Mr. Lowry, is that conservatism now? Is that vanquishing? Is that de-evolving within the Republican Party now? Do you think that we're moving away from these, looking back at the old declaration? After all, Trump's platform was the first platform in the history of the Republican Party with no mention of the Declaration of Independence in it whatsoever. Do you think we're moving in an unconservative manner?
Well, I think it's a complicated question. I still see fairly universal commitment among Republicans to the constitutional order. I think that's still very foundational. You could take, Mitch McConnell and J.D. Vance, who don't agree on foreign policy or on some economic questions. I think you'd get absolute unanimity about that. The issue is Trump, who doesn't, he hasn't, he doesn't have a deep understanding of these things and is liable to pop off in ways that are very disturbing. Like, when he said sometime 2 years ago, whatever, let's suspend the Constitution so I could be reinstated, which is obviously crazy. But if you look at actually what he did when he was president, it was an enormous achievement to nominate all of these constitutionalist judges, and that was a function of the movement's commitment to that, rather than Trump's personal commitment to that. So I think that the divisions and where you see traditional conservatism losing ground are more practical questions about economic policy and foreign policy rather than that foundational commitment to the Constitution.
How important do you think it is that our representatives need to show some fidelity to the Constitution in higher offices, president, Senate, governors, to their state constitutions? Our constitutional Republican movement looks to inform the voters that they need to hold elected representatives to some sort of constitutional conscience, to some knowledge of the Constitution. In my view, Governor Christie would have been an excellent candidate in that regard because he did follow the state constitution and implemented constitutionally conservative policies. How important is it to you and the conservative movement, in your opinion, that we require a intellectual rigor regarding the Constitution and the ability to articulate policy?
Essential. This is a key thing. I'm glad you asked it, that people tend to forget. It's not just judges and justices who are supposed to enforce the Constitution. Everyone, yes. Every elected official who raises their right hand and gets sworn, they're taking an oath to do that.
Yes.
So I hate the trend, especially among presidents, to say, well, I don't know, this might be legal, might not. Well, we'll see what the Supreme Court says. George W. Bush did this when he signed the McCain-Feingold campaign, so-called campaign finance reform, saying he believed a key provision of it was unconstitutional. They never should have signed it. We've seen Joe Biden on rent and on student loans, same sort of attitude. I don't know whether I can do this, but we'll see what the court says. That's not what you're supposed to do. That's the founders would be appalled by that. Lincoln would be appalled by that. And by the way, I was remiss when I was talking about the Constitution. The question prior to this one, obviously the gravest offense against the Constitution from Donald Trump was floating the idea that Mike Pence had the authority somehow to reject the duly certified electors on January 6th. And it's been shameful that J.D. Vance has gone along with that argument here 3 or 4 years later.
And Mr. Lowry, did you have the opportunity to read The Sweep and Force of Section 3, written by William Bald and Michael Stokes Paulson, two highly regarded constitutional conservative scholars? Did you have an opportunity to read that review that came out earlier in the year?
I don't believe I did.
I find that very fascinating and very enlightening. They make the case that Trump indeed violated his oath in defending and preserving the Constitution by his actions, or lack of actions, even on January 6th. We take that very seriously. We don't think that somebody should be given a pass when it comes to their fulfilling the oath to preserve and defend the Constitution. And of course, we could say the same about the lax executive policies on the border and the allowing illegal immigration to infiltrate. Of course, that is an abrogation of the responsibility of the presidency as well. So it's on both sides that we're seeing this total disregard for the Constitution. Do you have any hope that we could get back to thinking more constitutionally conscious with our elected representatives and those who are in law and our judges? Do you think it's possible?
I do. I mean, there's always hope. I think some of what we've just been discussing is an aberration with Trump rather than speaking to anything that's going on foundationally with the Republican Party. And it's a mixed bag. Again, as I was alluding to earlier, Trump, this was just obviously appalling, his post-election conduct in 2020 in all sorts of ways. But he put in place with those 3 appointments to the Supreme Court, a court that is more rigorously constitutionalist than I don't know, last 100 years or something. It's historic achievement. So the court is kind of a backstop to violations of the First Amendment and the Second Amendment, the structure, the federal structure of the Constitution, all of that. It's just you don't want to have to rely on it to be the only thing standing between us and unconstitutional acts. So that goes back to what we were just saying earlier. Every federal official is sworn to uphold the Constitution and should take that oath much more seriously.
Discuss a little bit about National Review and tremendous challenges now. I remember my father getting the subscription for 40 or 50 years. He lived to 96, and I am a faithful subscriber to National Review. Talk about the challenges now, print media, and of course, people can go on and look at the information on the website, but how difficult is it now to be in the publication business, especially as a conservative icon, which National Review is?
Yeah, so it's a challenging environment for print. Obviously, that's affected everyone. It's affected us. I think that's a secular trend. I don't think it leads anytime soon to the extinguishing of print. I think there's still people who I certainly do enjoy picking something up and holding it in your hands. But one way we've reacted to this is investing more in the magazine, but in a different way. We used to come out once every 2 weeks, fortnightly, as a very Bill Buckley type word, fortnightly, as we said at NR. A lot of people didn't know what that we're talking about when we said that and thought we were either weekly or monthly. We were neither, obviously, but we've gone monthly and created a much more handsome product, taking a little more time with the articles, more time with the layout. The paper stock is nicer. So it's more something you want to kind of have hanging around on your coffee table. So that was a change. It wasn't a retreat from print, but a change that we thought was appropriate in order to make it more enduring. So we'll hope we'll always be publishing a print magazine, but obviously digital is important. We've had an active website, I don't know, for 24 years now, and we need to do more of this, but we obviously have podcasts, we're doing video, we need to do more video, but those are just alternate means of spreading the same message. And this goes to another point of genius for Bill Buckley. He exploited every single medium that was available to him, whether it was radio, whether it was TV, whether it was newspapers through a syndicated column, whether it was a magazine. And he'd write all sorts of things. He'd write big 5,000 word essays for the New Yorker, kind of thing you wouldn't necessarily do for NR, or even longer, 10,000 word essays. He'd do interviews with Playboy, to get the word out there. He'd go on Laugh-In, one of the late night comedy shows, but then they'd also publish this great magazine. And if we want to stay true to his tradition in terms of not just the intellectual ideas he believed in, but how he went about spreading them, we need to make sure we're using all these forms of media.
And how important do you think it is, Mr. Lowry? We obviously have a civic education crisis in our nation. We've talked a lot about this and had many distinguished guests on the program to discuss this, many academics and educators and scholars. How important do you think it is that our starting really from kindergarten on up through, of course, we know the universities are a challenge, but how important in your mind is it that the people understand what civic education entails, learning about rights and learning about how they can be proactive within government, and what role National Review can continue to do in propagating and encouraging civic education amongst the citizens of the country?
Well, this is hugely important. A nation needs its memory. It's what helps define it and set out its identity. And this is just something we've been falling down on. I was talking to a colleague the other day whose child is, I think, going into 8th grade, and just now, first time learning about U.S. history. That the prior grade, 7th grade, apparently the class was world revolutions, and they included the American Revolution like within that. But apparently, they portrayed the founding fathers as these greedy white guys, and that just sort of ideology is pervasive. So you have a two-pronged problem, both of which are awful. You're either not teaching it, which is terrible, or you're teaching it in a distorted way that lies about our own society and history. Something that's really unprecedented throughout human history. People lie about other people. They usually don't lie about themselves, and that's what we're doing. And National Review has always had a role and it's not just a advocacy organization and a media organization. It is in its way an educational organization. Maybe you feel the same way, but
Yeah.
I started reading NR in high school. I learned about C.S. Lewis through NR. I learned about Whittaker Chambers through NR. I learned about Orwell and Huxley through NR. I read the book reviews. I learned about American literature, and then a lot of this content was hard for me to understand because I knew nothing about it. But then it would prompt me to go, all right, I'll go read Mere Christianity, because I've seen 10 references to it in the last 15 issues in National Review, and then that opens an educational door. So we need to be, National Review has always played that role, we'll continue to play it, but we also need to be thinking about other means that we can try to fill the gap left by our educational system.
Yes, there's no question about the role that National Review has held in helping educate our citizens on civics and the history of our nation and government. As we wind down, Mr. Lowry, I'd like to get your opinion. It would seem to be that the Republican Party and so-called conservatives now, that definition of conservative now is almost in a state of flux because of the influence of progressivism. And we've seen this with the Trump administration. We've seen the ideas of the characteristics of populism, of demagoguery, of we saw a 2019 poll, Mr. Lowry, that asked conservatives about presidential power, and so-called conservatives were interested in increasing the power of the presidency beyond what the Constitution prescribes in Article 2. Very, very alarming. Getting away from the Constitution and the limits placed upon the presidency. This is not a conservative view at all. How important is it to you that we return an intellectualism, which William F. Buckley personified, and National Review and the work that you do continues that importance of intellectualism? Because it would seem to be that intellectualism, there's a vacuum now, and it's becoming more marginalized within conservative thinking in the Republican Party.
Yeah, of course, I think it's very important, but we can't underemphasize the other side of the coin too. So if you want to go back to Buckley and Reagan, so Buckley is the intellectual, the writer. Reagan, although he, as we were talking about, took ideas very seriously and knew a lot and was a good writer in his own right, he was a politician. So a politician needs to be emotive. He needs to have a common touch. He needs to pay attention to what's driving passions. And so you need both. I think we're weighted way over to the kind of emotive side right now. But if you look at the famous Buckley-Reagan debate over the Panama Canal, it sort of exemplified this divide, because Bill ended up being right about that. It wasn't a debacle that we turned over the Panama Canal. But so Reagan was on the wrong side opposing it, but he was on the popular side. And it's very unlikely he would have won the Republican nomination in 1980 if he hadn't taken that position. So that wasn't Bill's job to get nominated for anything himself, but it was Reagan's job. So he had to be aware of a different set of concerns and conduct himself differently. So you need both. And I think populism, the way classical liberalism and populism have always been part of the Republican Party, going back to its founding. It's just most of that time, or almost all that time, the classical liberalism has been dominant over the populism. Now we've flipped, and it's our goal as classical liberals, or should be, to try to flip it again. But that doesn't mean that populism goes away. You need an element of that populism. The problem is if it becomes exaggerated and overly dominant, then you get this attitude that you've been hitting on. Well, rules are for suckers, and understanding all this is for suckers. We don't need that. We just need our common appeal. And again, I'm not saying you don't need a common appeal. You do, but you can go too far and jettison other things that are important.
I think that Mr. Buckley and Reagan may have had a disagreement on amnesty too during the middle of the the second administration. Of course, Reagan signed a deal with Tip O'Neill, hoping to get some tax breaks, but Tip O'Neill didn't follow through on his end of it, and that's started this escalade of immunities, which causes this culture of lawlessness, which now we're reaping the benefits or the lack of benefit from. Mr. Buckley was right on point with that particular policy as well. I want to thank you very much. Yep, I'd like to have you back to talk about your book on Lincoln, but I greatly appreciate your time, and I encourage everyone to get your National Review up to date and get it subscribed. And we do appreciate the great work that you're doing And thank you, Mr. Lowry, for being with me today.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much. And we will see all of you again on another Constitutional Republican virtual conversation.